Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Subletti. There are a couple of quotes here. One is a description for a fine breeding woman named Pat, lame on one side, with child and her three children named Let, Millie, and Charlotte. So, although this woman was lame on one side and could not move because she was good breeding stock, she was saleable. We're in part 3 of the book. This section is called Silent Prophet, and it starts with an advertisement that was published in Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette on May 3rd, 1733. Newspapers as money as people. There is to be sold a very likely Negro woman, aged about 33 years old, who has lived in this city from her childhood and can wash and iron very well, cook victuals, sew, spin on the linen wheel, milk cows, and do all sorts of housework very well. She has a boy of about 2 years old, which is to go with her. The price as reasonable as you can agree, and also another very likely boy aged about 6 years, who is the son of the above said woman. He will be sold with his mother or by himself, as the buyer pleases. Inquire with the printer. So, as you can see, there was a family of people to be sold at auction because they were all about making money. I want you to listen to my intro and I'll be right back.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Greetings, Forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. As you can see, they were willing to put this woman to work. She was a young woman that had been in this area since her childhood, so she was local stock. And she had had children in this same market, and they were also selling those children. Her child that was 2 years old was to remain with her and to be sold with her, but her 6-year-old could be sold separate from her as the buyer pleases. From the beginning of newspapers in America, the forced servitude business was a steady part of their revenue stream. That means for as long as they were publishing newspapers, their ad revenue primarily came from the enslaved people who placed ads, the slave owners who placed ads for enslaved people for sale. American newspapers and slavery helped grow each other. The first regularly published American newspaper, issue number 1 of the Boston Newsletter in 1704, contained an advertisement that read, "This newsletter is to be continued weekly, and all persons who have houses, lands, tenements, farms, ship vessels, goods, wares, or merchandises, etc., to be sold or let, or servants run away, or goods stole or lost, may have the same inserted at a reasonable rate." Emphasis added. So you see that? They wanted to make money off of the runaways. They wanted to make money off of the servants, off of the slaves, off of the human cargo that they were selling. The Boston Newsletter was distributed at the Boston Post Office and was printed by the colonial postmaster, a linkage that would continue into the age of the postmaster printer Benjamin Franklin. Advertisers were slow in coming to the publications, but among the earliest, in issue number 7, was a slave sale ad saying, advertisements, 2 Negro men and 1 Negro woman and child to be sold by Mr. John Coleman, merchant, to be seen at Colonel Charles Hobby, Esquire, in his house in Boston. Tens of thousands more would appear over the next 154 years. Maryland had a newspaper as of 1727 called the Maryland Gazette. Published in Annapolis, it ceased publications in 1734. The printer, William Parks, moved to Williamsburg, the bustling port on the James River, where in 1736 he started the Virginia Gazette. Note, a second Maryland Gazette appeared from 1747 from a different printer. Now as is then, the unique economics of newspapers necessarily relied on income from diverse sources. The popularity of the word gazette in so many colonial newspapers' names derived from its then concurrent connotation of the official record, which allowed the paper to get government business printing public notices. But newspapers also derived a steady, dependable income from slavery-related advertisements. Newspapers ran 2 main kinds of slavery-related advertisements: for apprehension of runaways and for sale or hiring. In the former case, the case of the sale or hiring, the existence of this new advertising medium strengthened slavery by creating a system of vigilance that made long-term escape less of a possibility. In the latter, newspapers not only ran advertisements for slave sales, but also facilitated them through brokerage firms by furnishing venues for a sale to take place, and even by consignment of slaves to the paper's printer. So the newspapers could act like brokers for slave sales. In turn, the soul driving business grew and prospered with the marketing power afforded by this up-to-date medium, as per the advertisement in the Pennsylvania Gazette of November 18th, 1731, which said, "To be sold, a likely Negro wench about 15 years old, has had the smallpox, been in the country above a year, and talks English. Inquire with the printer thereof." The printer was 25-year-old Benjamin Franklin, who bought the Pennsylvania Gazette in 1730 after its founder, Samuel Keimer, went to debtor's prison. Keimer, though English, was a follower of the French Prophets, a millennial sect of Huguenots in London. In an account of his sufferings, he referred to himself as a white Negro, predating Norman Mailer's use of the term by more than 200 years. He relocated to Barbados, where he began the Barbados Gazette, which ran many slavery-related advertisements. But he was a white Negro, right? When Franklin's newspaper and his retail location in Philadelphia brokered slave sales like the one at the beginning of this chapter for a girl at the beginning of her childbearing years, because remember, she was only 15 years old, Franklin, the only one of the founding fathers to have been an indentured servant, owned slaves for 30 years or so. A concerned student of the problems creating and retaining wealth, Franklin fused what we now call the media with political power in America via networking and new technology. A vegetarian in his youth, the Pythagorean regimen, as it was called, he was also an amateur avant-garde composer who invented musical instruments and, while living in France, wrote in the then new string quartet idiom a striking, unique-sounding, three-movement work played entirely on open strings. Franklin franchised his newspaper operation, partnering with printers in other towns. We have previously noted his silent partnership with the South Carolina Gazette. When William Parks was preparing to start the Virginia Gazette, Franklin advised him to build his own paper mill, the first in the southern colonies, and sold him the rags he needed to make the paper from. By the mid-1740s, writes David Wallstreicher, whose Runaway America, Benjamin Franklin's Slavery and the American Revolution, has informed this section of our narrative, Franklin was the largest paper dealer in the colonies. He controlled paper itself and saw its uses as medium and as money. Franklin's influence as an economic theorist was all the more significant because his ideas were grounded in real-world practice. He made his Pennsylvania Gazette into a new kind of newspaper, as no one quite had before, writes Wallstreicher. He learned to make his printed manufactures, the newspaper, and the annual almanacs, essential goods in the booming economy. As part of that process, Franklin got himself named as postmaster of Philadelphia in 1737, a significant and profitable post office for newspapermen, since newspapers constituted the bulk of what the postal system carried. So he was making money hand over fist. He subsequently became the Deputy Postmaster General for British North America and ultimately Postmaster of the United States, creating the new postal system. For much of his adult life, He used the post office as a base from which to dispense patronage and build his personal network as the North American economy grew. Franklin was an anti monetarist in an economy where he might have to accept and store and sell a quantity of tobacco as payment in lieu of silver. He was a strong proponent of paper currency. From his perspective, in America, where land was cheap but labor was dear, Franklin saw wealth in terms of labor, not silver. Franklin's writings of the 1730s and 1740s pivot repeatedly around notions of money as akin to people and people as capital, writes Wald Stryker. Karl Marx, who quoted Franklin approvingly in Das Kapital, described him in 1859, over 100 years later, as the man who formulated the basic law of modern political economy. Marx was referring to Franklin's anonymously published pamphlet in 1729, when Franklin was merely 23 years old, titled A Modest Inquiry into the Nature and Necessity of Paper Currency, which said, trade in general, being nothing else but the exchange of labor for labor, and the value of things is most likely measured by labor. But by labor may the value of silver be measured as well as other things. Thus, the riches of a country are to be valued by the quantity of labor its inhabitants are able to purchase. What he's saying here is that the wealth of a nation is stored in the amount of slave labor a nation can pin up and hold on to. Somewhere between 6 and 10% of the population of Philadelphia at the time was enslaved and was therefore purchasable labor. The Pennsylvania legislature dropped the duty on slaves from 10 pounds to a mere 20 shillings in the 1720s and throughout the 1730s. An ever increasing number of kidnapped Africans were arriving. Franklin owned at least 2 slaves, though he found them troublesome. In a 1748 letter to his elderly mother about domestic matters, he wrote of an enslaved couple that we conclude to sell them both for the first good opportunity, for we do not like Negro servants. And this is why people think that he was an abolitionist, but in reality, he profited off of the slave industry. Franklin lived to be 84, and in his late years, he became a vocal abolitionist, correct, after he had made all of his money as a young man. But that was after he made his fortune with newspapers that acted as clearinghouses for slave sales and published runaway advertisements. Using the unpaid labor of Black slaves, indentured servants, and his wife Deborah, Franklin operated a book and stationery shop on the street level of his printing house. In a cash-poor society, Franklin frequently had to take payment in the form of South Carolina rice or West Indian sugar, selling it at his store, and on at least one occasion accepted a slave as partial payment for a debt. Not for nothing did the 1990s rappers speak of $100 bills as the Benjamins. Franklin saw paper money as a democratization of capital, and thereby as a broader franchise for the wider civic participation he favored, though that did not include the participation of Negroes to whom a cash value was assigned. In the wake of the smallpox epidemic of 1731, Franklin published a calculation in his newspaper saying, "The number of those who died here of that distemper is exactly 288. 64 of the number were Negroes. If these be valued with one another at 30 pounds per head, the loss to the city in that article is near 2,000 pounds. He only saw us as capital." Correct. Benjamin Franklin was one of the first white nationalists. Exactly. In a sense, Franklin's newspaper and his almanac were his money. Since they were paper, he could exchange for commodities. But Franklin also literally printed money, more than 770,000 pounds worth of notes for Pennsylvania between 1731 and 1764, as well as notes for Delaware and New Jersey. As a newspaper publisher, he had a bird's eye view of the variety of contemporary commerce. He routinely had to handle complex transactions entailing a mix of barter, credit, and occasionally cash, with heightened insight into the workings of the colonial credit economy. He understood clearly how, quote unquote, money could take on various forms. So he was the one who birthed the idea of the negotiable instrument. France had tried a disastrous experiment with paper money in 1717, urged on the Regent Duke of Orleans by John Law, the gambler son of an Edinburgh goldsmith. Law created a paper money for France, backing it with future revenues from the infant colony of Louisiana, which had neither a staple crop nor a labor force. This is the problem with fiat that we're experiencing today, that people don't want to say the quiet part out loud, because money that is not backed by a tangible good is really worthless paper. But the American dollar is currently backed by the threat of violence, but that threat is shrinking every day. To that end, a cedar swamp was cleared in 1718 and New Orleans was built. As he privatized France's foreign debt into a single paper-issuing monster corporation, there followed a speculative bubble in which Law's notes traded at 10 times their face value in Paris, with the inevitable crash coming in 1721. After that, France was soured on paper money until the 19th century. The crash was more or less concurrent with the London South Sea bubble, but Britain bounced back much better. As Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware bulked up with slaves, South Sea Company ships from Africa pulled up into the ports of the Chesapeake. Discharged from widely disparate West and Central African slaving territories, the cargoes, the people, were sometimes very large, as per the advertisement from William Berg's Gazette on April 8, 1737. The second year of the paper's existence, they published the following ad. Advertisements. The ship Johnston of Liverpool, Captain James Gildart, is arrived in York from Angola with 490 choice young slaves. The sale of them is to begin on Tuesday the 12th instant at Yorktown by Thomas Nelson. Alexander Hewitt in 1779 described the situation of South Carolina 40 years previously, saying, "Adventurous planters in Carolina, eager to obtain a number of Negroes, always stretched their credit with the traders to its utmost pitch, so they overextended themselves. For as Negroes on good lands cleared themselves in a few years, they by this means made an annual addition to their capital stock. After obtaining this credit, it then became in their interest to maintain their superiority in assembly and discharge their debt to the merchants in the easiest manner they could. The increase of paper money was always proved to them a considerable assistance, as it advanced the price of those commodities they brought to the market, by which they canceled their debts and the merchants, so that however much this currency might depreciate, the loss occasioned by it from time to time fell not on adventurous planters, but on the merchants and money men who were obliged to take it." In other words, slaves were safer money than paper currency. This would continue to be true in the slave territories of the United States until the end of slavery. This statement right here highlights the fact that we were the money. We brought the value to the land. We brought the value to their industry. We added increase to their wallets and to their bottom line. This is why they encouraged natural increase or slave breeding on such a high scale, because you could start with one male slave and one female slave, and if they produce children, or if you forced the female to reproduce children, then you could instantly increase your wealth by 20 pounds sterling, 30 pounds sterling, 150 pounds sterling, and it was like compounding interest if she was a breeder. The newspaper runaway ads in Virginia and Maryland in the 1730s were more often for indentured servants than for black slaves. This is because it's easier for a white person to run away and integrate socially into the society as a white person, even if they're a poor white person, than it is for a black person to integrate into a white society. The descriptions of the absconded, quite often detailed, provide the closest we have to a thumbnail sketch of the white servant population. But by the 1750s, black slaves, many of them described as Virginia born, dominated the runaway ads. Virginia born meant that they were born in Virginia, and they were more than likely, mulatto. Slave sale advertisements appeared in the Virginia Gazette from its earliest numbers in 1736. They were numerous by the 1760s, by which time they stressed the Virginia-born provenance of the human merchandise. 4 advertisements that appeared on page 4 of the January 8, 1767 issue of the Virginia Gazette offered 60 odd, exceedingly fine Negroes, all except 2 Virginia-born. Sundry valuable Virginia-born slaves. About 100 choice Negroes, most of them Virginia-born. And another ad read, 60 choice Virginia-born Negroes. Now, not only was it more likely that these slaves that were Virginia-born were mulatto, They were also easier to domesticate because they didn't have a memory of Africa prescient and fresh in their mind. They often couldn't speak the language and communicate with the other generation. They could implant in those people what they wanted them to know. Greetings, Sister Ra and the elders listening with you. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. The opposite of Virginia born was outlandish, a word that subsequently came into common use in a more general sense. Virginia born laborers had a number of advantages in the market over the outlandish. They were English speaking, they were trained in plantation work, they were seasoned, in other words, had immunities to American diseases, and importantly, they were considered to be more docile and were carefully kept away from military training. Outlandish Negroes might have military experience. The destabilization of Africa, occasioned by the slave trade, created a legacy of war, as well as a means of funding those wars. They provided captives for slave traders. African soldiers captured in battle were sold in American markets. In Virginia, a preference for slaves with no military knowledge was reflected in their higher prices. Raised from birth to work slave work regime, the Virginia born slave had never known freedom. They did not file their teeth sharp, an African tradition that in the Americas became a means of defense for people who were not allowed to carry weapons. Those scary looking filed teeth turned up in an August 20th, 1761 advertisement placed in the Maryland Gazette by the 27-year-old George Washington, who, ever the alert commander, was prepared with precise descriptions of his servants and slaves in case any of them decamped or ran away. When he advertised for the return of 4 Negroes named Perez, Jack, Neptune, and Cupid, he advised that Jack had cuts down his cheek, being his country marks. Neptune had his teeth filed sharp, and his back, if rightly remembered, has many small marks or dots running from both sides of his shoulders down to his waistband, and his head is close shaved. So imagine that Killmonger body but bald. This was the British military method of identifying black soldiers, of whom there were many. Washington, an acute observer, differentiated the runaways' language skills, though he couldn't pinpoint their origins within Africa. Neptune and Cupid, he wrote, were brought in on an African ship in August of 1759 and talked very broken, unintelligible English. The second one, Jack, is a countryman to those, and he speaks pretty good English, having been several years in the country. The other, Perez, speaks much better than either, indeed, has little of his country dialect left, and as is esteemed a sensible, judicious Negro. Quite possibly, though we do not know, an enslaved fiddler played for the dancing at the splendid ball of April 26, 1738, in Williamsburg. Surely Miss de Grassenbrett's guests that night were waited on by liveried black servants, even as her soiree was enlivened by a show of cruelty. A slave sale in the form of a raffle was advertised in the Virginia Gazette, dated March 31st, 1738, almost a month before this ball. This is to give notice to all ladies and gentlemen that there will be a ball on Wednesday evening, the 26th of April next, and an assembly on Friday, the 28th, at the house of Miss de Grassenbretz in Williamsburg. Tickets to be had by her. There will be set up to be raffled for a likely young Virginia Negro woman fit for house business, and her child. For more than a century, slaves were occasionally sold by raffle in Virginia, where gambling was a mania. The seller hoped to realize more money from a raffle than from an auction, and the ticket buyers got the entertainment value of seeing who won the human prizes. What will you draw? A carriage, a garden tool, a couple of children? The only losers were the people being raffled for fun and profit. But then again, it was common and convenient belief among slave owners that Negroes, being a lesser kind of being, did not feel the sorrows of parting from kin as deeply as white people did. Directly below that advertisement for the raffle was another one for the following night, which combined the raffle of a young man with grotesque dances, saying, "This is to give notice to the ladies and gentlemen that there will be a public assembly at the Capitol on Thursday evening, the 27th of April next. Also, several grotesque dances never yet performed in Virginia. Tickets to be had of Mrs. Stagg. Several valuable goods will be put up to be raffled for. Also, a likely young Negro fellow." Sometimes the raffle method was even used as to liquidate a large estate. Henry Winesec calls attention to an advertisement in one of two concurrent competing Virginia gazettes for an estate liquidation to take place in Williamsburg, in which 55 slaves were announced to be raffled in 39 lots. This form of dispersing an estate at random guaranteed the maximum degree of dismemberment of the family and community structures that had existed on the plantation prior to being liquidated. There was little chance, for example, that a Negro woman named Kate and her young child named Judy would be won by the same person who won a Negro girl Aggie and a boy Nat, children of Kate. So this woman and her 3 children were being auctioned off separately, and it was unlikely that the 3 of them would wind up in the same household because of the nature of raffles. George Washington was the third of 20 co-organizers listed for that raffle. The advertisement is too long to reprint in full, but suffice it to say that one of the lots offered as a raffle prize was, quote unquote, a fine breeding woman named Pat, lame on one side, with child, and her 3 children named Let, Millie, and Charlotte. The advertisement ran in the April 14th, 1768 issue of Rhine's Virginia Gazette with no date for the sale specified. The sale apparently took more than a year and a half to pull off, being advertised once again in the issue of November 23rd, 1769, with the date of December 13th set for the drawing. The fine breeding woman Pat was once again represented as being with child a year and a half later. So she was a breeding woman, and they were continuously breeding her and profiting off of her and extracting more wealth and value out of her by forcing her to have children for them. It was done at a tavern, and the conviviality that implies and animated by the thrill, not of buying, but of winning Pat and her children, or maybe children who were being separated from their mother. Washington seems to have taken part in the drawing of lottery winners to judge from his journal entry. Went to Southall's in the evening to draw Colonel Moore's lottery, a process that took 3 nights. As Winesec puts it, Washington himself was raffling off slaves. Before Winesec's book was published in 2003, no previous biographer of George Washington had called attention to his participation in this utterly depraved practice. Winesec then attempts to account for the transformation of Washington into the man who, in his last will, took the then unusual step of freeing his, though not Martha's, slaves. Now remember, most of his slave wealth came from the slaves he got by marrying a widower, Martha Washington. And you got to remember that their slaves mix with one another and that the birth order follows the mother. So if one of Washington's male slaves impregnated one of Martha's female slaves, that child was a slave of Martha and was enslaved for life, even though he may have freed some of his slaves. It was a much smaller quantity than the slaves of Martha that were carted off and carried on and continued to be enslaved. Washington, it should be noted, was free to liberate his slaves. He was not under crushing debt when he died, so they were not seized and sold. He had no natural heir, having not sired any children with Martha. If he had had a son to inherit his property, it would have been seen as a betrayal to devalue his estate like that. I think God has a quarrel with you for your abuse and cruelty to the poor Negroes, wrote English preacher George Whitefield in a letter to the inhabitants of Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina concerning their Negroes. The forecast reminds us that Washington treated his slaves so bad they constantly ran away, like Ona Judge. The cross-eyed Whitefield had a mighty voice, and he was the first big-hit performative evangelist to travel throughout the colonies. He was one of the founders of Methodism, along with the brothers John and Charles Wesley. In approximately 1729, while they were all students at Oxford, his version was Methodist Episcopalianism, a Calvinist offshoot of Anglicanism. His speaking had intrigued, though not converted, Benjamin Franklin, who, after hearing him speak and making some calculations, concluded that his reputation for addressing tens of thousands at a time in England was probably not exaggerated. That was the sort of thing that caught Franklin's attention. Though he had no interest in this new sect of Methodism, Whitefield intended to implant in North America, he was a media man, and he was clearly fascinated by the sense of communication this phenomenal figure had created. His Pennsylvania Gazette published the schedule for Whitefield's high-profile journey throughout the colonies. During the second of his 7 American tours, on April 17, 1740, he devoted his whole front page to Whitefield's sensational open letter that said bluntly, "Considering what usage they commonly meet with, I have wondered that we have not more instances of self-murder among the Negroes, or that they have not more frequently rose up in arms against their owners." It was the first anti-slavery tract in any colonial newspaper, and the only one that would run for another 30 years. Anglican clergymen read droning, word-for-word sermons that they might not even have written themselves. But Whitefield was dynamic. The forecast says George Washington threatened to send a boy to the West Indies to be disciplined like Jack the wagon driver if he wasn't more submissive. So George Washington was no friend to the African. Remember that. Whitefield had a theatrical, which was to say a disreputable background, and his revivals were a kind of popular theater. In South Carolina, he was denounced by Anglican pastor and naturalist Alexander Garden. Alexander Hewitt wrote that he was not unlike those strange and erratic meteors which now appear now and then in the system of nature. In his youth, as he often confessed and lamented, he was gay, as in happy, giddy, and profligate, so fondly attached to the stage that he joined a company of strolling actors and vagabonds and spent part of his life in that capacity. At this period, it was probable that he learned that grimace, buffoonery, gesticulation, which he afterwards displayed on the pulpit. So he learned his theatrical performative arts by being an actor first. With theater still in its early days in the colonies as of 1740, this evangelical Great Awakening, a cynic might call it the Great Wave of Superstition, was the first cultural phenomenon to tie together northern and southern colonies. Methodism already had a base in Georgia. The brothers Wesley had been there since 1736, when Oglethorpe, the one true abolitionist in the area, invited them to minister to his colony. The Wesleys, in turn, invited Whitefield to come to Savannah, because remember, Georgia was not supposed to be a slave state, where he started the Bethesda Orphanage, raising a sizable amount of funds to do so. But they differed on doctrinal issues. Whitefield's Calvinist Methodism held that God's elect would be the only ones to go to heaven no matter what. But John Wesley, in what he called the Arminian heresy by its enemies, democratized salvation by insisting that anyone could attain it, a free will doctrine that would be fundamental to African American Christian belief as well. So, as you can see, doctrinal issues broke them apart. After Whitefield's celebrity arrival in the colony, The trustee's secretary, William Stevens, wrote that he hoped clergymen would focus slave owners' minds away from rape and incest, though he didn't use those words. What he said was, it may be hoped that good work is lately begun from Mr. Whitfield's, so daily gaining on the affection of the people, but there remains the practice of open lewdness in first making whores of their female servants, then cohabitating with them and their bastards, from whence a continuance of the same course may be presumed. He said it so eloquently, didn't he? Rape and incest. Whitefield's followers had a tendency, distressing to slave owners, to go out and convert the enslaved, one who on one occasion chose the occasion of being converted to go raving in the woods for some time till their masters were obliged to take them under discipline. While Alexander Hewitt acknowledged grudgingly that religion in America owed not a little to the zeal, diligence, and oratory of this extraordinary man, he was troubled by Whitefield's converts in South Carolina, who became abolitionist preachers for a time before they were repressed. After him, a servile race of ignorant, despicable imitators sprung up and wandered from place to place, spreading doctrines subversive to all public order and peace. The subversive Whitefield preached the gospel to white and black both, or white and black alike. Methodism, in its early days, was doctrinally anti-slavery, and some black South Carolinians converted. But South Carolina had a minuscule population of free blacks, and enslaved blacks on the plantations were kept far away from these evangelists. The big wave of conversion would have to wait until after independence, when religious intolerance became constitutionally prohibited. Inerrant evangelists had a freer hand. Despite his early abolitionist posture, Whitefield came to feel that Georgia could never be profitable without slave labor. Remember, that's the conclusion that a lot of people came to about Georgia. He brought slaves to work at his orphanage, spoke up in favor of legalizing slavery in Georgia, and ultimately became a plantation owner in South Carolina. He was said to treat his slaves kindly, which is to say that he was a founding father of the school of Christian slave owning that would later dominate Southern ideology, which historians generally refer to as paternalism. Shockingly to many, Whitefield preached to the enslaved in the 18th century. Almost no effort was made to proselytize them. Slave owners were, by and large, not eager for their captive labor force to be Christianized. Congos arrived pre-Catholicized, though their version of Catholicism was Congo all the way down. Other captives from Senegambia and elsewhere practiced a sub-Saharan form of Islam. Various belief systems of West Africa were active, and the old hoodoo religion was everywhere. Hewitt wrote of South Carolina in 1779 that the Negroes of that country, a few only excepted, are to this day as great strangers to Christianity and as much under the influence of pagan darkness, idolatry, and superstition as they were at their first arrival from Africa. But Christianization of the enslaved was moving forward when Whitefield died in 1770. A poem was published eulogizing him that caused a sensation. An, an Eliac poem on the death of that celebrated divine eminent servant of Jesus Christ, the late Reverend and pious George Whitefield, by Phyllis, a servant girl of 17 years of age, belonging to Mr. J. Wheatley of Boston, and has been but 9 years in this country from Africa. That poem made Phyllis Wheatley famous. Born in Senegal, Wheatley gained a first-rate command of English only after a few years. Her spiritual poetry had an edge to it that might not be easily apparent to the modern reader. Her best-known poem, called On Being Brought from Africa to America, was practically a civil rights demand to be allowed to participate in the evangelical movement, saying, "Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and joined the Anglican train." Her ardor for Africans to achieve spiritual greatness was fully present at her debut in her eulogy to Whitefield, which said, "Take him, ye Africans, he longs for you. Impartial Savior is his title due. If you will choose to walk in grace's road, ye shall be sons and kings and priests of God." Slave owners took pains to disabuse the notion popular among the enslaved that Christianity was a path to freedom. There was no path to freedom, not for the enslaved and not for their descendants. The South was from the beginning dependent upon the economic magic of slave production, deeply integrated as it was into the very basis of credit. There could be no climb down position. The permanent riches of this country, wrote Hewitt of South Carolina in 1779, consisted of lands, houses, and Negroes, and the produce of the lands improved by Negroes. Raw materials, provisions, and naval stores were exchanged for what the province wanted from other countries. From very early on, there were only two choices for the South. Ending slavery would have meant watching their vast paper wealth of its oligarchy disappear. That wasn't going to happen. The other course was to commit fully to a two-caste system, the perpetually free and the perpetually enslaved. So as you can see, they committed themselves to having a two-caste system, perpetually enslaving the African and actually expanding enslavement in some ways, because right now to this day, you are a slave to the cost of living. Because guess what? If they planted fruit trees in your metropolitan areas where the fruit grew, you would get a ticket for picking the fruit because it would be made illegal. You can't grow farm animals at your house and slaughter them on your own. Do you even have that set of skills? You go to a grocery store. You go to a grocery store to get food. You go to a farmer's market to get fruits and vegetables. There's nothing wrong with these things, but you have to understand the position that not growing your own food puts you in. You have to understand the position that not being able to control your means of production puts you in. You have to understand the position that having to pay taxes puts you in. Even if you own your house free and clear without a mortgage, which is called a death note, because the expectation is that you will pay it until the day that you die, and your children will inherit the debt, which is the exact position that I am in. Even if I did not have a mortgage, I would still have to pay taxes. So we are slaves to the cost of living in this society. Still to this very day, slavery was expanded. It was augmented. You can willingly be a slave. You can agree to be a slave. And you agree to be a slave every time you exchange your labor for money. As the forecast says, perpetual means forever. They will keep us under them as long as we allow it. For as long as we allow them to keep their foots on our necks, for as long as we allow them to have the upper hand, to define our reality, then we will be forever enslaved to them. Exactly. Voluntary servitude is an option according to this U.S. Constitution. Work is voluntary servitude. But guess what? If you don't work, then you're not going to be able to pay for a place to live. If you ever saw the TV show Snowfall, there was this young man named Franklin who had made lots of money, made lots of money selling drugs. That's not neither here nor there. At the end of that series, I remember seeing a clip where he said, "I'm free. I'm finally free." And he was walking down the streets, dirty, dingy, grimy, having lost his mother's house to taxes because he would not pay the taxes, because he was not in a position to pay the taxes. You have to recognize that you have to put yourself in a position where you are providing goods and services to someone that is actually going to allow you to be free, to liberate yourself. This is why it's a good idea to go to Africa and see what they have to offer. See what types of resources you can bring to the table, what type of skills you can bring to that environment, what type of market can you break into so that you are your own boss. You are not a slave to the cost of living if you own a company and you're doing business and you put yourself in a position where, yes, I'm providing a good or a service for this money, but I'm not constantly under the thumb of these people. I'm not attached to a 9 to 5 clock. I'm not put in a position in a place where I have to kiss up to somebody in order to make sure that my at-will employment status doesn't change overnight. These are the types of things you have to think about. And remember, we do not have any historical friends. Okay? We have unique alliances that have occasionally benefited us, but we do not have any historic friends. Dr. John Henrik Clarke tells us and reminds us, if we want a friend, look in the mirror. Okay? If you want a friend, look into the eyes and soul of another Black person. And even then, look twice, because they might be a coon. He reminds us that we have no friends. So your best option for organizing your economy is to build a family unit, or to start with your family unit, where you have life insurance policies on everybody that's in the group. That life insurance is payable into a trust. That beneficiaries on the trust are the remaining members of the family. Okay? That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to start a situation where you and your family members are all putting so much money. It could be $100, it could be $10. I don't care what it is, but putting money together to save, to purchase an asset together. Okay? This is another option for you where you and your family members or you and your selected group of favorite people that you trust are putting together resources so that you have the ability to take that money that you are working for and leverage it to acquire an asset. That asset can be land or that asset can be a skill, because knowing how to play the stock market is a marketable skill that is necessary. Being a bookkeeper is a skill that is necessary. Learning these different types of things are opportunities that you can look at and you can recognize, hey, maybe we can do this together. Because remember, you together, you may go slow, but you'll go far. Individually, you may go far, but you'll burn out fast. All right, guys, that's all I got for tonight. I will be back later this week. We'll be reading Brainwashed, and I will see you on probably the 3rd and 4th of July, because I don't know what's going on. I don't know if my family's having anything. I thank each and every one of you for being here. I thank you, Forecast, for listening, and Sister Ra and the elders that are listening with you. I know that Bawana Haguziki is listening. I know that Manning for Mayor is listening. I know that Oni Tase is listening. I know that Koku is listening. I know that Dorico Cooper is listening. I know that Netha Wino is listening. I know that Melissa McPherson is listening. I'd like to welcome each and every new person that has subscribed to my channel. I value each and every one of you. Thank you for your contributions to this mission and goal that I have to read through these books and to discuss them with you, to give you my thoughts and my opinions on how we can progress as a people. Remember, they bred us in attempts to make profit. That was their only goal and objective. They put us in the position of chattel. They put us in the position of chattel, of movable property. They broke up our families. They commoditized our sexual acts and production processes. So they put us in a position where we devalued each other and saw only value in the white man. That is the brainwashing that they have given us. We'll be talking about Uglified when we come back. Thank you, guys. I appreciate you, and I will see you later this week. Peace.